Well, thank you, Jamie, and Governor, thank you so much for being here. I assume I don't need to introduce Governor Tim Pawlenty. He's been a major national figure, and I must say, one of those who has devoted a great deal of attention and learning and speaking about foreign policy, which is not something that you see every day. And I think it's very important that people like Governor Pawlenty take such interest in it. In fact, sufficient interest that you were recently, well, not so recently, but you went to help monitor the Tunisian elections. Is that correct?
I did, just a few weeks ago.
Yeah. You want to tell us a little bit about that experience? Because, you know, we watched it on TV and people are interested in the outcome, but I was wondering whether you want to give us a feel for what you saw there.
Well, it was a great honor to be there. And, of course, the individual, Mohammed Bouazizi, who started the Arab Spring in many people's accounts, is somebody who we owe a debt of gratitude to, a tragic end to his life, but really began the unfolding of events which we now describe as the Arab Spring. But Tunisia, as you probably know, is a country of about 10 million people. The northern part of Tunisia is coastal and in some ways kind of a resort area for parts of Europe. The middle part is agricultural. The southern part is the beginning of the Sahara Desert. The country, of course, is wedged between Libya and Algeria. And for that region, it has relatively high educational attainment levels, notwithstanding the fact that it was governed by an autocrat and a tyrant, Ben Ali, for many decades. The people there had a relative understanding about democracy and freedom, at least in terms of their understanding and commitment to it. And as to the elections themselves, almost all the foreign observers noted some minor problems that were I think just more administrative rather than mischievous or fraudulent. But by almost every account, the elections in Tunisia were fairly conducted procedurally. The results, of course, had Ennahda, the Islamist party, winning somewhere around 40% of the vote, and a significant plurality leading towards the parliamentary process. However, they have to now coalesce with non-Islamist parties, and it's unclear what that coalition will ultimately look like. But in their rhetoric leading up to the campaign, Ennahda, of course, indicated that they were going to be a, quote-unquote, in their words, moderate Islamist party along the Turkish model. Some people believe that. Some people are skeptical and suspicious of it. We'll see. Time will tell.
Well, which camp are you in? Skeptical?
I don't think we have enough information yet. If you look at their rhetoric leading up to the campaign, the way they conducted themselves during the campaign, it was pretty clear that they were trying to embrace the mantle of a moderate Islamist party. But I think with all these things, the proof is in the behavior, not in the rhetoric. And I don't think we should jump to any conclusions about whether they are in fact moderate or not. I think we should judge them by their behavior, and we'll see.
I mean, there's obviously a great deal of concern here in the United States, obviously a great deal of concern in Israel, too, about the whole idea of Islamist parties gaining power. We've just had the elections in Egypt, which gave a little over 40% to the Muslim Brotherhood, a little over 20% to the Salafist party, Noor. And I must say I hear from a lot of people that what this means is clearly it was a mistake pushing Mubarak out the door, as people often put it. It was a mistake to support these elections, and now, particularly in Egypt, maybe we have to find some way to pull back on this. What's your view on that?
A couple of things, Bob. I think most informed people realized that the Brotherhood was going to do well in the Egyptian elections. I think the additional surprise in all of that was the strength and the emergence at the level that they revealed themselves as the Salafist party, or the Salafist movement. That additional component put added worry for those of us who are concerned about an Islamist movement, a radical Islamist movement taking over in Egypt. So that's a concern, and the Salafist subplot to all of that was, I think, a particular surprise to some. As it relates to Egypt and what we could have done or should have done before the fall of Mubarak and the events unfolding now, I would rewind the tape more than just now and look at this over the last 20 or 30 years. And it's a great case study for the United States relationship and approach to countries like this. Egypt is obviously unique in many respects, including its size and importance in the region. But for example, when Mubarak clearly stole the parliamentary elections in I guess it was 2008, or maybe 9, I forget the year, but there was a parliamentary election leading up to it. The United States and the world stood essentially silent. I mean, those elections, by all accounts, were corrupt. They were fraudulent in many respects. International observers noted that, documented it. I don't think it's even seriously debatable. And in response to those parliamentary elections, and frankly Mubarak's role in that, the rest of the world, including the United States, stood silent. And so it was perhaps not the straw that broke the camel's back, but we, I think, would have been better served, and the free world would have been better served, and if democracy would have been better served, to incrementally nudge Mubarak over years and decades rather than have it come to a head as it did in such a dramatic, really unprepared fashion. And you could see the handwriting on the wall. I mean, Mubarak was going to be gone one way or the other before the Arab Spring. I mean, this is an nearly 85-year-old dictator in poor health whose time was going to come to an end either as a result of natural longevity, a heart attack, other concerns or challenges. His plan, of course, was to make his son his successor. By most informed accounts, that wasn't going to work. So as we look back on that, what was the transition plan? It wasn't a choice between pushing Mubarak out or not in that 1 month period. Mubarak was going to be gone relatively soon anyhow, either way. And so the question arises, what was the plan? What really was the plan? Mubarak's plan was to kick it to his kid. That wasn't going to work. And we now see with the benefit of hindsight that the groundwork, the infrastructure, the preparation for democracy building and transition in Egypt was not well established. And so it wasn't nudge Mubarak out or not. He was gone pretty soon. And I think, obviously, in my view, much of the free world was caught flat-footed as it related to the preparation work that should have been done, not in that 1 month period, but in the 6 months and 6 years preceding.
I guess the question of if, you know, again, maybe people in the United States and certainly I know people in Israel would ask is, look, I mean, everybody loves democracy and it's great to talk about democracy, but if democracy in the Arab world is going to mean, as it seems to be certainly the case, if it's going to mean political systems dominated, overwhelmingly dominated perhaps by Islamist parties of varying shades, is democracy really in our interest in that situation? I mean, wouldn't we be better off with someone holding the line, whether it's the Egyptian military, whether it's a Mubarak or successor?
Well,
how do you make the case?
That question, I know you don't personally embrace this, Bob. You're just being the appropriate.
Well, I get asked that question. I want to know what the right answer is.
You're being the appropriate provocateur. The question implies that there's an option to maintain allegiance with autocrats, tyrants, dictators, oppressors, and suppressors of freedom and democracy and the human spirit, and that over time that will work. That's a flawed premise. So could we have enabled various tyrants, dictators, oppressors, autocrats, monarchs who suppress their people, deny freedom, reject democracy for a while longer in some places? Maybe. Was that a wise course? No. Is it sustainable? No. So the premise that, you know, we had the option to just flip a switch and continue the status quo is unrealistic, and it denies the realities of the region, and it denies the reality of the democratic spirit. Now, that being said, we shouldn't be flippant about that, because we saw what happens when you have elections in places and with organizations that are ill-prepared, and that we were ill-prepared. You know, the notion that we're going to have an election for the Palestinians and allow you know, the result with Hamas to occur, and obviously you can't go from generations or decades of tyranny, autocracy, dictatorships, no infrastructure around democracy, free and fair flow of information, free and fair elections, the infrastructure needed to build parties and campaign in a fair and appropriate and persuasive way. You can't go from tyranny to that overnight. So planning these things with some transition in mind, orderly transition, would be helpful. It's particularly painful to look back now and see the current administration, but you can also look back even further and see other faults in the region. You know, cutting democracy building in Egypt by some estimates 74% in the 2 years preceding the fall of Mubarak. You know, very one measure of a lack of commitment. And so I'm one of these Republicans, by the way, when people in my party say, let's just get rid of all foreign aid and all foreign assistance. In the context of budget limitations and budget constraints, can we reduce it? Yes. Should we eliminate it? No. We should make sure that we focus it, and we should be particularly committed to building not just goodwill, but good allies, and we should be particularly committed to funding these kinds of efforts that support transitions to democracy in an orderly way.
Well, that's a good answer. I like that answer. I'll remember to use that next time I get asked that question. In Egypt now, you've got a number of players in place. You've got the Brotherhood, you've got the Salafists, you've got whatever there is, maybe under 20% of the secular party, liberal party got votes, and you have the Egyptian military. There's going to be a question coming up pretty soon about how is the next constitution going to be written? And you may have seen that the Egyptian military, or at least someone in the Egyptian military, said they would be writing the constitution, or they would oversee the process, not the parliament. The Brotherhood said no, it's the parliament who's going to do that. As we see Egypt moving forward, and even in the United States, again, you hear people saying it's the Egyptian military that's going to save us from the Islamists. You have other people saying, but the Egyptian military itself wants to be a dictatorship. How would you steer the course going ahead in terms of dealing with the Egyptian military, dealing with the constitutional process?
Well, the Egyptian military, as you all know, is enmeshed not just in military matters and matters of national security and foreign affairs on behalf of Egypt, but they are a business enterprise by all accounts. And so they have their fingers in, both financially and managerially, into many aspects of the Egyptian economy, some related to the military, many not related to the military. So this is not just a balance of power constitutional question. It's not just a governance question. This is also, at the core, partly a financial issue. And the premise that the leaders of the Egyptian military are going to let go of that power and that money very easily without having some reasonable assurance about how that looks in the future is a very important question. Some people jump to the Turkish model and say, well, my goodness, when you look at Ataturk and the post-Ataturk period, the military played an important counterbalance in Turkey. The situations are somewhat different because the Turkish military was not enmeshed in commerce to the same extent that the Egyptian military is. And of course, Erdogan has been very deft at now, from his perspective, recalibrating the role of the military in Turkey. That sets up this point. There's going to be a tension between the Egyptian military and the march towards parliamentary rule. In the end, the parliamentary rule is going to prevail because the military, notwithstanding their power, notwithstanding their ability to exercise police powers, they can't sustain shutting down the people's will. So there'll be a tension. I think it will largely play out peacefully, and over time, the military, in my view, will recede because they cannot withstand the scrutiny of another revolution where they are the autocrats.
If they didn't do that, if they were pressing to maintain control of power and reluctant to turn power over, would you in any way limit or cut the $1.3 billion of assistance that the United States gives directly to them?
Well, we should be very careful about that, and this is going to be shades of gray and matters of degree as opposed to all one way or all the other. If you look at some of the senior leaders of the Egyptian military, they are old. What I just described implies that they have a self-awareness and a global awareness, and I'm sure that they do to some extent, but don't underestimate when you are, towards the end of your career and have spent most of your career under Mubarak and have a dramatic set of self-interests around maintaining your current power, they could overplay their hand. But I would be reluctant if the military was within a range of just proper tension points between a parliamentary future and maintaining their proper role, and it was within a range of reasonable debate. I would be reluctant to pull the aid because it's one of the few pieces of leverage and tools that we have in Egypt. I mean, obviously, it's important.
Okay, great. Let's move on to Syria. You were very early, I think, in calling for more proactive action on the part of the Obama administration in Syria. Since those days when you were very outspoken on that subject, a lot's happened. I think the UN has just reported that they've now counted up to 5,000 people killed. There have been Arab League interventions. But honestly, there doesn't seem to be much sign of Assad budging. I'm wondering what would you do at this point if you were president? What steps would you take on the part of the United States about Syria?
Well, I think the view of Syria and Assad by the United States government was naive, particularly under this administration. There was a lot of hope. I think it turned out to be false hope that he was going to be a reformer, or in fact, in some people's account, was a reformer. I think that largely was not true. It was inaccurate. And the United States was lulled, I think, into a less proactive posture than it should have been. As we now know, he's a killer. And he's a tyrant, and he's killing his own people in the streets of Syria. And we had, in the early days of this conflict, delay, confusion, equivocation, lack of clarity, lack of strength from this administration on behalf of the United States regarding these events. They subsequently adjusted that somewhat, but it was slow. It was, like I said, in my view, equivocal, late, delayed, and not strong. I think we should turn every screw we have and get him out of there. I called for him to go. I think I may have been one of the first national leaders to say that he needs to go very early on. And I would pull short of saying that requires military intervention. But if you look at what Reagan did in Afghanistan Part 1, if you look at what Reagan did in Poland and Eastern Europe post-Soviet Empire, or as that was unraveling, if you look at what Reagan did in parts of Africa, there are ways to undermine and foment change in countries short of direct military intervention. And I certainly would use all the cards we have with respect to sanctions, all the cards we have with respect to our friends and allies and organizations around the world to mutually apply pressure, and including rhetorically. And that's why when you have the president and others equivocating in these crucial moments, it's not real hard. When you got a tyrant killing people in the streets of his or her own country, it's not hard to say, that's wrong, he or she should go.
What about now, though? I mean, what do you want to do in terms of, there's options like establishing a no-go zone where potential defectors or the opposition can organize. I mean, a lot of people, you get the impression in Syria, would like the United States to pursue the same kind of option we pursued in Libya. But it's very difficult for an opposition to organize itself when it's constantly being hunted down. So what's your view on that?
Well, we have a number of ways we can help with that. One, Turkey is switched from pro-Syria to concerned and being helpful to the opposition. And so there's a, maybe not by name, but at least a partial equivalent to a protective zone on the border along Turkey. The Arab League is being uncharacteristically, at least rhetorically, helpful in this regard. I think we should do what we can to equip with information, resources, and capabilities, the opposition. We've got to be a little more mindful of Syria than in Libya, because Syria has got dramatically more military capacity than Libya had. And they have the capacity to, if they are cornered in a way that they feel there's no way out for them, they can inflict a lot of damage, not just on us, but on Israel in the region. So we got to be very careful about not just being flippant about saying it's easy to topple Syria. They've got significant more capacity than Libya had.
Okay. Well, moving around the region expertly to Iraq. Prime Minister Maliki was in Washington. He and President Obama met, and Obama mentioned how important it is that we're pulling out of Iraq, but I think both tried to emphasize the ongoing relationship. Meanwhile, there's a New York Times story reflecting concerns in Iraq that Maliki is now carrying out a kind of purge of suspected Baathists, that maybe he's going to be cracking down, and that there's some concern about how much of a Democrat he is. I'm just curious to get your reflections, both in terms of what the administration policy has been, and also your concerns or hopes, as the case may be, about Iraq moving forward.
Well, we will know the answer to your question some years from now. And what we know at the moment is this. We have a democratically installed government that's tenuous, whose motives and capabilities are not fully tested or not fully known. And I've been to Iraq 5 times, most recently last year. And the United States of America has put too much blood, treasure, loss, sacrifice, commitment to have all of that be turned on its head in a painful or tragic way. My hope would have been that the President of the United States and Maliki would have come to an agreement about a residual U.S. presence there, at least a few thousand for purposes of training, intelligence, air support and integrity, and the like. I think it's an open question whether Iraq is going to slip backwards now because they're missing that capacity. In fairness to President Obama, one of the hang-ups was immunity for our troops. That's an important demand and one that we should have received, but it's a failure. It reflects a failure by both of those leaders to not reach an accord when they both, I think, would acknowledge the need exists, and to not be able to fill it in a formal and appropriate way, at least at a residual level, I think is a failure on both of those leaders' parts. I think we would have been well served to have a residual force in Iraq. We will see now in the coming years whether Maliki, either in terms of his intentions or his capacity, is up to the challenge, or whether this backslides. And if he goes down the path of purging Sunnis, marginalizing and confronting Kurds, further associating or aligning with Iran, and the country were to backslide in that direction appreciably, you have some commentators who would say we will have done for Iran in Iraq what Iran couldn't have done for itself. I hope that's not the case. I hope and pray that 10 years from now we have at least a semblance of a continuation towards a stable, better equipped democracy, both civically and militarily.
Okay, well, let's go to Iran. There's obviously been reports of tremendous progress. There's the IAEA report warning about Iran's ongoing nuclear program. There are estimates. No one, I don't think, knows how to read these estimates of when Iran might have enough material to possibly begin making a bomb. But in any case, certainly over the next 2 years, both Israel and the United States are going to have to make a decision about what to do about Iran. What decision should they make?
We have to make the decision that leads to this result. We cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon, in my view. And so we need to have every sanction we possibly can. We need to use every plausible covert capability we have to delay, stall, or defeat that intention and that plan. We should make plans and preparations and show the flag in the region. I support having at least a continuous or more regular fleet presence in the area. And then we're going to have the next president, or maybe even this one, but certainly the next president's going to have to likely confront the issue about how and when to make additional decisions. But the result of all of that has to be we cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon. And we're going to have to use every plausible means at our disposal to stop it. There's apparently some very good work that's been done so far with that in mind, as we've seen. But it needs to continue.
You're referring to explosions in the middle of the night.
Well, when you have scientists' cars blow up on their way to work, and explosions in the middle of the night, and computer worms that allegedly are delaying the project substantially, those are all, I think, positive efforts based on what we know.
But if sanctions didn't work, and I have to say there's not a lot of evidence that they have worked so far, if the explosions in the middle of the night are not sufficient to slow down the program, and we say that, and you say that it's unacceptable for Iran to get a bomb, the end of that logic is that you have to be willing to use military force to do it.
In my view, that option has to remain on the table, no question.
Are you not concerned about some of the ramifications of a military action? I mean, if someone wanted to push back, they would say, first of all, we won't know exactly what we've hit and how far we've set back the program. Second of all, there's all kinds of Iranian options for retaliation, both against Israel, against in the Straits of Hormuz, potential terrorist attacks in the United States. It would seem to me a president weighing that decision would have a very weighty decision to make indeed.
It's going to be an extremely weighty decision. However, let's break that down a little bit. None of us have access to the intelligence, so it's difficult for any one person to say how difficult the mission would be or wouldn't be. So we would need to have access to that information. I would just say if there is a plausible way to delay or defeat their intentions, that avenue should be explored and, if need be, executed, implemented. There is no question that it would be a mission filled with lots of risks and possible collateral consequences, and that would all have to be sorted through. But the other side of the coin is, if you know they're about to get that capacity, you have a plausible chance to remove it, and you don't, and then they use the weapon, or weapons plural, you will have committed a malfeasance in office of a historic magnitude.
Let me just press one step farther in terms of the operation itself. I mean, I think most people believe this. Certainly, if the United States undertook such an action, they wouldn't just hit suspected nuclear weapons manufacturing sites. They would also probably take out air defenses. They might take out Iran, as much of Iran's ability to respond as possible, which really means it's not a surgical strike. It's quite a, if you agree with this, it's quite a substantial strike with likely high numbers of Iranian casualties. Does that give you pause, given that that's the likely kind of operation an American president would order?
Prime Minister Netanyahu did a television interview not long ago where he said there is only one military in the world who can fully execute this potential mission, and it's not Israel. And if you look at the likely complexity of the potential mission as to location, what would have to be overcome to make it effective, what would have to be done to make sure the retaliatory capabilities were minimized, what would have to be done to sustain the capability, the idea that this would be a brief series of airstrikes, I think, is incomplete thinking.
Well, what about then, you raise a good point, which is, since many people fear or suspect or hope, I suppose, depending on your perspective, that Israel might undertake this action itself, the other people would be concerned that Israel really can't complete the job, as Netanyahu has suggested, and that the United States would be willy-nilly dragged into a conflict before perhaps it had made up its own mind to do so. How do you feel about Israel undertaking a step like that?
It's not the place of the United States to tell Israel, what to do or not to do in this context.
Actually, can I ask you, why isn't it?
Well,
we have told allies throughout history what to do and what not to do. Just to set out as an abstract theory, I'm wondering, why isn't it?
Well, they're, first of all, a friend and an ally and a sovereign nation. And so, if you spun it around and suggested that other countries were going to tell us what to do, I think many of us in the room would take umbrage at that. But obviously, they're an ally. We work with them. We would want to have a constructive plan and approach with them. But I just reject the premise that we're going to tell them what to do or not to do. We can suggest, we can advise, we can consult, we can incentivize, we can discourage, we can discourage. But in the end, it's they have sovereign authority to make their own decisions. But I think if you listen to the people who understand these issues at great level, the idea that Israel could do this alone and sustain it is at best, a debatable proposition.
Well, let me just a couple more questions and then open it up to the audience. I'm sure are eager to ask questions of you. Just pull the lens back a little bit. Again, just thinking about the Middle East. We haven't even gotten to Russia yet. Maybe that'll come up in our Q&A.
Right,
Russia's obviously an important part of the unfolding Arab Spring. There is often heard, I would say, especially in Republican circles, a view that the problem is not this or that group. It's not even terrorism per se. That the problem is really Islam. There is a tremendous sentiment that, again, the victory of Islamist parties is simply by itself bad for the West, bad for the United States, because Islam is fundamentally a kind of hostile ideology. Some are now comparing it to communism. And even looking at this issue domestically, one hears a great deal. I find when I speak to Republican groups, almost the first question I get asked is, aren't you worried that Sharia law is going to take over in the United States? And I think there's a article a column by Michael Gerson today in which he quotes Newt Gingrich saying, Sharia is a mortal threat to the survival of freedom in the United States and the world as we know it. What's your take on this whole question?
Well, first of all, if you look at Islam, there is a subset of it that is radicalized and wants to effectuate their intentions through violence. and with particular targets in mind, one of which is the United States. So it's not a fantasy or some paranoia to believe that there is a portion of Islam that has unfriendly, hostile, and violent intentions towards us and towards our allies. It's also not a stretch to say that for those who purport to be the teachers of radical Islam, they embrace things that are an affront to, in many cases, human rights, the rule of law, human dignity, and the like. There are folks who profess to be the keepers of the doctrine who would say it's appropriate to have the death penalty for anybody who leaves their belief in the Islamic faith. They have individuals who say that it's okay to amputate somebody's arm for a minor theft. They have folks who believe in the notion that women are to be disrespected both physically and legally. On the latter point, if you're a girl in a family, it's okay to have the inheritance behalf of what the boy is. That's just one mild example of a bunch as to the mistreatment, maltreatment, disrespect of women, both legally and physically, and the list goes on. So those are positions, principles, legal perspectives that are dramatically different than what we have held in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world. So to the extent there's those who want to take that and create a theocracy, whether it be through a full caliphate or smaller chunks of it, that's not something that is paranoia without some justification. So we should be concerned about it. And it doesn't mean we take a broad brush and say all of Islam or all Muslims are a certain way, but clearly you have a subgroup of individuals within Islam that are radicalized who have those kinds of statements and intentions and want to act on it and do great harm. And to individuals, to democracy, and to the security of the region, and in some cases, in their larger vision, the world.
Indeed, I guess the question is, is there something inherent in Sharia law that creates this? Because there are people who are not necessarily making a differentiation.
Yes, I mean, again, different interpreters of the doctrine would say different things, but some of them say, if you exercise your choice to leave Islam, will kill you. That's real troubling. So is there something inherently wrong with that? Yeah. Yeah. And when they say it's okay to kill others with that kind of doctrinal perspective in mind, is that something inherently wrong with that? You bet.
What about domestically? Are you concerned about the potential imposition of Sharia law?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about it. I don't think, I'll give you one real life example. Some people say, well, people like Pawlenty or others are exaggerating the threat. When I was governor, one of my state agencies implemented not a Sharia law doctrine, but instead of charging interest for home mortgage financing, they charged fees. And they didn't call it Sharia law, they called it new market mortgages, but it was clearly intended to accommodate the Sharia law concerns around not paying interest. And when I learned of the program, I shut it down. But that's one example of American law migrating in that direction. Now, are there many, many examples of that? Not, but there's at least the beginnings of concerns.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, let me open it up to questions. So please, if you would, when you stand up, just identify yourself and please ask a question, an actual question. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Ken Meyercord, World Docs. I'm old enough to remember when a number of countries in Latin America were ruled by dictators back in the 60s. And when our support for these dictators was criticized, the official line was usually, we can't do anything, we don't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. As I understand it, you feel we not only have a right, but a duty to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. In light of the fact that some people might question the purity of our motives, do you think we should only do that when it's sanctioned by the UN?
Well, as to the latter point, should we subordinate our decision-making, our interest to the UN? Answer, no. They can be helpful in a collaborative way, and to the extent it's consistent with our interests, but the idea that we'd subordinate decision-making from the United States perspective to the UN, I don't buy that at all. And as to the point about Central America, Latin America, and other dictators around the world, look, it's pretty clear the United States has, at times, enabled and supported leaders and regimes that are not democratic, obviously. But the premise that that can continue indefinitely is sustainable or right, as I said earlier, is a flawed premise. So we're going to have to transition, but we want it to be in an orderly way, and we'd hope that these countries would move towards democracy, freedom, human rights, free and fair elections, free and fair flow of information. And if they don't have the capacity and the infrastructure in place to do that quickly, and most of them don't, we're going to have to spend some time building that up. That's why I think the better plan with Mubarak would have been, instead of trying to hang on to Mubarak in his final form, we would have been better served to constructively nudge him along to relieve some of the pressure along the way over the course of a decade rather than have it come to a head. And then lastly, when you have situations like Iran, if they were to get a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon, and you're the President of the United States and you've got a choice to try to eliminate that capacity before they get it and do it plausibly, recognizing all the complexity and challenges that Bob's question implied, my own personal view is you've got to deny them that capability. I've got to take them at their word. I mean, Ahmadinejad and the regime in Iran has said repeatedly and publicly they will wipe Israel off the face of the earth, or similar comments, that they'll push them into the ocean, that they will annihilate them, that there won't be one Jew left standing, in their words. You know, you can go down the list of others who feel similarly, but you know, to put that kind of mindset, those kind of individuals with a nuclear weapon is a real concern, and it needs to be addressed.
Over here.
John Bunnick. I got a two-part question. What's your thoughts on the situation with the Coptic Christians in Egypt, with their, all the violence against them and military not backing them up? Do you think it might descend to a civil war after a while if things don't improve? And what's your take on Rick Perry saying that we should start all foreign aid for zero for each country, even for Israel? And just some comment on the Sharia law. If you want to look at issues with Sharia law, just look at Europe, like at UK and France. They have major issues with the Sharia law being established over there, going above their rule
Yeah, I
of
mean,
law.
as to Sharia law, we don't and shouldn't have it in the United States. We have a rule of law based on our common law tradition, our American law statutes at a federal and state level, and my personal view is we should reject at every instance any embrace, any installation of Sharia law in our country. That's my personal view. As to the Coptic Christians in Egypt, it is a huge concern. And they face grave risks, I think, going forward, because we don't know for sure how this is going to unfold. You're going to have the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists, maybe one or two other key coalition partners running the country. And it is concerning, some of the comments that they've made, some of the signals that they've sent about what the future of Egyptian government may be as it relates to religious minorities. Some of their words have been comforting, but others, at least from individuals, have been deeply troubling. And so we should make sure that we shine a light on that situation to try to provide protection rhetorically in terms of the global and international spotlight on that issue, to try to give as much support and protection to the religious minorities as Egypt as we possibly can, including using the pressure. And we do have pressure on the military. I mean, keep in mind, we don't know what the future holds with them, but they have a massive relationship with the United States military. They have a massive training relationship. They have a massive equipment relationship. They have a massive financial relationship. And so we have some significant leverage over the Egyptian military.
In the back there.
Daniel Callingard with Freedom House. Governor, I'd like to ask you about Russia. How profound do you think are the changes that are underway? And do you think that current U.S. policy is adequate to support democracy there?
Well, I think the changes underway are profound, and the United States entered into a quote-unquote reset with Russia a few years ago that I think that was naive and has been a failure. And the idea was we were going to hold out a softer hand to Russia. They were going to embrace it, and they would reciprocate in measurable and meaningful ways. And that has not essentially happened. In my view, the nuclear arms treaty that was signed is flawed, and the ambiguity around missile defense systems that Russia claims, prohibits robust development of missile defense systems by the United States. And if we don't follow that, they're going to nullify the treaty. I have deep concerns about the treaty. Putin's behavior and his party's behavior in Russia is showing no signs of movement towards democracy. In fact, the elections just a little while ago show fraud and continued mischief through his leadership. I think the United States is very ill prepared for it. We may have received an unknowing and just coincidental break because he overplayed his hand in that election by engaging in the fraud that he did. He's now instigated the protests. The protests in their current form are relatively modest, but these things are unpredictable, and this is now organic in a world of social media. And now you have the owner of the New Jersey Nets declaring he's going to take Putin on, and obviously he doesn't necessarily reflect all of the dissent, but he may be a crystallizing point and a resource point to further it. But as to the United States government and how prepared we are for what could be unfolding events in Russia, I would say a very naive foreign policy with respect to the reset. Putin and Russia, and I always say this about foreign policy generally, but it particularly applies to them. Bullies respect strength. They don't respect weakness. And you may have learned it as a kid on the playground. You may have learned it in sports. You may have learned it in business. You may have learned it in a bar fight. You may have learned it in a back alley. But it is always true. When you are dealing with bullies, and Putin is a bully, they only respect one thing, a strength. And to have President Obama and others say, the new exchange with Russia is going to be mutual accommodation, and we accommodate and they snicker, that's not a good foreign policy with respect to Russia.
I think if there were administration officials here, they would probably argue in response to that they got some real tangible benefits out of the relationship. They got Russia to support much tighter Iran sanctions than they had in the past. They got them to provide a supply route to Afghanistan, which we obviously are dependent on. In general, they got more Russian cooperation than they might otherwise have gotten. These are tangible gains that they think they received. Would you not argue if that these were worthy goals and that perhaps losing them will be a cost for us?
I think it's fair to say that the supply routes into Afghanistan is an accommodation that they gave us. You can assign a weight to that relative to other alternatives and the importance, so that I would acknowledge that point. After the treaty was signed, there were confirmed reports of Russian officials being in Iran and helping Iran with their civilian nuclear program. Much to the consternation, I think, of many here that thought, well, that we're going to have tighter sanctions as it relates to trying to get them to stand down on a nuclear development program, when in fact one of the key enablers of Iran's nuclear program, in fact, appears to be the Russians. And so, that seems to be inconsistent with the goal of doing all we can to get them to help put the screws to Iran.
Yep. Anybody over here? Yes, sir. Right here.
Governor Wayne Boyles, President of the Boyles Company. How do we prepare the countries in the Middle East for the hard work of democracy, knowing that what they've done so far, they've only gotten to the 50-yard line, and they've got to set up working legislatures, working together, having patience with each other, having love for each other, having love for the process. How do we, as a government, or working with our allies who have Western parliamentary democracies, how do we prepare these people for the hard work of democracy that is to come for them?
Yeah. Well, I can give you one end of the continuum is Tunisia. So Tunisia, again, by regional standards, more educated, the economy's better off, a more informed citizenry, and an appreciation for the need for change. They embraced the election process. They conducted it freely and openly for the most part, and took it seriously. Now, the results may not be what we all wanted, I'd hoped for politically, but in terms of the infrastructure and the appreciation for the process, it's all what I think your question implied and hoped for. But they are on the high end of the continuum in terms of capacity. If you turn the page and flip that to, say, Libya, you've got a more chaotic, challenging situation. And it's not a point of, disagreement to say that, look, they have no history, they have no infrastructure, no leadership, no think tanks, no capacity. They've got people that fled the country who may come back, some of whom are trusted, some of whom are distrusted. But the answer to your question is, we've got to roll up our sleeves, and in some cases, we shouldn't even be the front part of that, because when they see Americans, they get skeptical. So in partnership with some of our other friends around the world, we've got to commit to doing the hard work of getting in there and training parties, equipping parties, providing democracy-building funds, establishing friendships through not making demands, but by building respect and real relationship. This stuff takes time. You cannot flip a switch, and we shouldn't be surprised that in an overwhelmingly Muslim place, if you have a precipitous election without much preparation, you're going to get a certain result. But that doesn't mean that it's written in stone and that some of this stuff cannot be changed. But it takes hard work, and it's going to take money. And so when you hear folks say, cut all the foreign aid, back to your question, sir, and I don't believe that. Again, in the context of budget constraints, can we shrink it and reprioritize it? Yes, but I think it is penny wise and pound foolish to say we're going to cut all foreign aid, particularly when it comes to these kinds of efforts.
Did you still want to have a question?
Thank you. My name is Vineta Mekon. I'm from Latvian Embassy. Thank you, Governor, for sharing your views. I have a question which was triggered exactly by what you said. You mentioned that with respect to Egypt, the international society had to react earlier, immediately after their elections. And you already talked about Russia, but I still have a question. What do you think with respect to recent elections in Russia? It's well known, or there are proofs which show that there were violations and there is fraud. So do you think international society should react on the election?